right, thank you so much everyone for being here. My name is John Harvey O'Hara. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. I'll be super honest and admit that I'm a bit nervous and also excited to be here. This is my first time presenting at a conference outside of my home institution. Today, I'm sharing a paper that is one part research ethics and methodology, one part case study. These ideas are very, very fresh, and so I'm hoping to get some questions and feedback from everyone. I'm calling this Bridging Backward, Kinship and Trans Historical Methodologies. So scholarship on trans histories has expanded in the last 2 decades, shifting trans studies away from our focus upon life after Stonewall. In particular, there has been a growth in trans before trans histories, by which I mean the stories of people who lived before the development of modern trans vocabularies. Stepping beyond this more recent timeline, scholars handle cases that can be seen as historical recoveries of trans potential, such as M.W. Bukowski's 2021 chapter on the 14th century English trans woman Eleanor Reichener, who was misgendered both by the scribe who recorded Reichener's story and by cisgender scholars who analyzed these records in the 1990s. There's merit to a degree in reclaiming trans potential within the archive. When we do so, we resist the tradition of what Bukowski calls cisgender scholarship. In her chapter on Reichener, Bukowski states that most scholarship assumes the cisgender status of any character or historical figure. Cisgender readings have been dominant for so long that they are treated as neutral. This can make it difficult for trans readings to enter academic discourse because they are seen as offering modern additions to long-established traditions. If trans historians are to overcome these issues with cis scholarship, then we must resist the traditions of cis scholarship through the development of trans methodologies. In a search for such techniques, I've analyzed some examples of these trans before trans pieces of literature, looking for patterns in the work of people like Bukowski. The main trend that I find is that things tend to go well when scholars analyze records of individuals whom the researchers provide with treatment that mirrors the norms for telling stories of living trans community members. Just as we would avoid using someone's dead name or sharing overly intimate details of their life, historians studying trans before trans individuals do well when they use a politic of reference usually provided in trans community spaces. Today, I'm arguing that researchers should employ community building or kinship building as a primary method of scholarship. When we do this, we recognize something similar enough to modern trans experiences in the lives of historical individuals to treat them as being like us. We say that they are or could be trans, and in this way, we draw them into community with us. To take this a step further, we kin ourselves with these historical figures as we tell their stories with respect. I'll discuss 2 examples of this in existing literature, returning to Bukowski's chapter on Eleanor Reichener, and then moving to Xavier Nunn's recent article on a trans woman living in Nazi Germany. Then I'll move to an example from 19th century Austria-Hungary to demonstrate this further. So why kinship? Kinship itself is part of the emotional bonds that people build through relationships. While most scholarship on kinship focuses upon one's family as it exists among legal or reproductive lines, writings on queer and trans kinship create room for the sort of emotional and social bonding that leads to networks of chosen family, friendships, and mutual aid. Still, much literature on kinship, even queer and trans kinship, focus upon demonstrations of kinship, rather than kinship as something that scholars do. Part of this is understandable. There seems to be a tradition of relating to historical subjects as rather distant from us, mediated by the time between us and them. And this makes the idea of relating to these individuals as kin almost counterintuitive. Additionally, kinship with historical trans individuals becomes particularly tricky, in part because of white and non-Indigenous writers' tendency to view the past as a unified trans history, including what Leah Devon and Zeb Tortorici refer to as the decontextualization and appropriation of Indigenous ancestors. So please let me be clear. I am not advocating that scholars connect with historical individuals outside of those individuals' cultural contexts. However, I recognize that as scholars, we relate to other people through our work, rather than only relating to sources as objects. Therefore, a medical autobiography, such as the one I refer to later in this presentation, is not merely text upon a page. It is a person's record of her own life, mediated by both her feelings towards her gender and her expectations for how the doctor reading the letter would react. With this in mind, I'd like to turn to those two pieces on trans individuals living before 1950 to show how scholars have applied this sort of ethic. Although neither of these scholars have explicitly used the term kinship in their methods, the level of care that they provide creates a bond between the scholar and their historical subject. M.W. Bukowski presented in her chapter, The Transgender Turn, Eleanor Reichener Speaks Back, the experiences of a 14th century trans woman and sex worker. Drawing on Reichener's story from legal documents, Bukowski centers Eleanor Reichener's own voice within the original court documents, demonstrating the fact of Reichener's self-identification in contrast with what she calls an untransing of Reichener's story done by generations of scribes and scholars. To demonstrate this, Bukowski points to Reichener's introduction of herself with the name Eleanor, which is later switched to John or Johannes, seemingly at the discretion of a third party, such as the scribe writing the account. Bukowski corrects this, referring to Reichener by her name throughout the chapter, much like one of us might correct the misgendering of a community member. Furthermore, Bukowski draws a connection between Reichener's story and modern experience through an examination of parallel treatment between Reichener and trans scholars, writing that the anti-trans bias towards Reichener's story that led to Reichener being described as a gay man or a man in a dress is like the anti-trans bias within circles of medieval studies scholars, which draws another layer of connection between the past and the modern. Similarly, Xavier Nunn's article, Transliminality in the Nazi State, offers insights regarding historical trans life while maintaining a level of care and respect one would expect to see in the trans community. Nunn depicts the story of R, a trans woman who transitioned using the limited means available during the Weimar Republic before being forced to detransition after the Nazi regime came to power. R's story, much like Eleanor Reichener's, is complicated by the source material. Nunn locates R through texts like medical records from R's institutionalization in a mental health facility. Nunn writes that his article dismisses the idealization of truly subjective sources as evidence of experience, which requires equally critical engagement as these official sorts of sources. Both of them include bias. Neither of them is of a higher register. Building upon these records, Nunn creates what he calls a consciously mediated picture of R's life, beginning with his naming of R. He writes that he only uses her last initial for data protection purposes. But also, there's the fact that R could not change her legal name to her preferred name, instead being forced to choose a gender-neutral one. Therefore, the decision to refer to R with both she, her pronouns and her last initial provides a level of respect, refusing both the violence of dead naming and the dismissal of R's chosen name by aligning her with her legal name. Additionally, Nunn's article is noteworthy because of his care for intimate details of R's life. In his discussion of R's life and treatment by the Nazi state, Nunn refers to private details such as the dynamic of R's marriage. He does provide some details, but these are neither sensationalized nor added for reader interest. Rather, these are included only with regard to the ones that lead to the deterioration of R's marriage, as well as the conflict between R's marriage to a woman and the state's understanding of R as a heterosexual person. Both of these aspects feature heavily in Nunn's analysis. At this point, I'd like to turn to an autobiography from the text Psychopathia Sexualis, a clinical forensic study by the Viennese psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing. After some background, I include a short analysis of a patient narrative. Krafft-Ebing originally published this book in 1886 as a study on what was then considered sexual abnormalities, and later editions contained a further exploration of so-called sexual inversions or contrary sexual feelings, which ran in stages from attraction to one's own gender to what Krafft-Ebing called metamorphosis sexualis paranoia, or the feeling of one's own sex being changed. In the section on the latter, Krafft-Ebing included Observation 99, the autobiography of an upper-class woman from Austria-Hungary. The narrative is a relatively standard medical autobiography, including details on her birth, her family and individual medical history, and a lengthy examine of her perceived condition. Namely, that despite being born as the son of a wealthy family, she knew herself to be a girl from childhood, and these feelings only intensified as she grew older. Within the narrative, the writer casts herself as a rather gender-conforming woman, which drew conflicts from the requirements of her assigned gender. From her birth in 1844, she was the only child in the family for several years and received great attention from her mother, which she delighted in. Her appearance aligned with feminine beauty norms. She describes herself as a very cute child with blonde curls and translucent skin. Here, the translucent quality of her skin indicates both racial normativity, as in her whiteness, and class status, because she described herself as an undeniably clean child, unmarked by sun and dirt that might have accompanied a lower class life. Also, her childhood was noteworthy due to her social behaviors, which aligned with ideals for girls. For example, she wrote that her mother took her into ladies' gatherings because she was very obedient, quiet, and polite. Additionally, she was seemingly accepted by cisgender girls as one of them, stating that her friends' sisters always treated her as a girl. This treatment continued into adulthood, and so she explains having difficulty flirting with women because they typically responded to her attempts at flirtation as though she also wore a dress. Such treatment did not embarrass her at first. However, she received significant negative attention for her perceived gender nonconformity. After teasing from her peers, she forced herself to associate with boys. This led to overcompensation, and so she wrote that she developed a certain wildness to try to fit in with her peers. Still, she wrote that she did this only to obscure her femininity, and she felt happiest when she could feel herself as a woman by dressing as one. As she aged, she understood herself even more as a woman, and so she wrote that even after she decided to marry, she felt the impression of this being two women living together, one of whom just happened to disguise herself as a man. The sense of conflict between her assigned role and her understanding of herself placed her beyond her society's boundaries for gender, which aligns with Susan Stryker's definition of transness as moving beyond social confines of gender. The autobiographer's race and class, however, situated her within a network of social obligations that in her time provided no option for transition. Instead, the writer utilized the comforts of her class to project a socially normative image of masculinity through steps like marriage to an appropriate candidate and reproduction of family traditions. She included a wealth of explicit details on how she managed private aspects of life, but I am explicitly choosing not to share these out of respect for the autobiographer's privacy. I unfortunately can't say how her story ended, as the account from Croft-Abing's text grants no clarity on the writer's life after the receipt of her letter, only showing us that she presented herself as a rather gender-conforming upper-class woman. This might have served her well had she been born a cisgender woman. To conclude, the field of trans history benefits when scholars utilize a level of care and respect that mirrors the treatment of living trans community members. Such treatment allows scholars to engage with deeply complex source material while still searching for the perspectives of our historical subjects and the effects of anti-trans bias both in the archive and in scholarship. Examples such as the Hungarian autobiographer from Sukapatia Sexualis demonstrate that there is room for us to connect with historical figures like we might with living community members, and to handle their stories with as much care as we would our modern kin. Because scholars like Bukowski and Nunn are already applying this politics of reference to individuals in the archive, I don't believe I'm doing anything wholly new here by suggesting this. However, as the body of Trans Before Trans scholarship continues to expand, it is my genuine hope that this manner of care and respect will continue, and that scholars will continue to expand these norms for trans historical methods. Thank you.
My name is Francisco. The paper I'm presenting today was written together with Andrés Mendieta. Unfortunately, Andrés can't be here today, but fortunately it's for a very lovely reason. It's because he's out on paternity leave, so congratulations, Andrés. But the paper we wrote is about trans masculinity in South America. And the context for this is that we are both trans men from Argentina. And in Latin America, in contrast to maybe, I think most of you here today are located in North America. In Latin America, more generally, transmasculinity has been much more invisible until much more recently. So even up until maybe the past decade or so, trans men and transmasculine individuals more broadly have been not that culturally recognized within. This obviously varies between countries, but just as a region, as a whole, we can see that transmasculinity has been more invisible than maybe in other areas of the world. And also in trans studies, well, trans studies tends to lean more towards the global north and towards Anglophone context in particular. But recently there has been more interest in Latin America within trans studies. But again, attention has tended to focus on trans women and travestis, which is a trans feminine gender identity local to some areas of the region. So last year, due to all of this, Andres and I decided to publish a short piece in Transgender Studies Quarterly, which I could forward to anyone if anyone is interested and doesn't have institutional access. Just proposing to a few areas we consider would be of interest to expand scholarship on transmasculinity within the region. And we looked within Latin America, we looked more specifically at South America, and even more specifically, mostly at the continent's southern region. So Argentina, which is where we're from, but also Chile, Brazil, just as examples, since we couldn't in a few pages thoroughly cover the history of the entire continent or region. So the three areas we wanted to point to that might be of interest first is we looked at historical subjects which might be of interest to a transmasculine archive. Secondly, we were interested in looking at gender transitions that happened in or during or around the region's dictatorships, which happened during the 20th century. And finally, we wanted to highlight some of the local and global contributions of transmasculine activists from the region. So first, well, Andres's PhD research, which is ongoing, is very fascinating, and it focuses mostly on archival materials from between the 18th century and the early 20th century. And what he looks at is at people who were assigned female at birth, but who lived as men. And so these people were usually called frauds by the press. They were called women impersonating men. And even just like the colleague who spoke before me pointed out, even more recently, historians often misgender people, or, well, we consider that they misgender people by calling them cases of strategic transvestism. So considering that these are actually women who try to live as men just to access power or jobs. And what Andres proposes to do is to read against the cisnormative grain of the archive and of even of recent scholarship in order to foreground first-person testimonies and look at how people's lives were actually lived. And what he usually finds is that these are people who lived as men in the long term, pervasively in different areas of their life, even in their personal lives. So Andres is trying to question or at least challenge previous readings of their lives. And again, as the colleague who came before mentioned, we might not be able to call these people trans, like we might not want to call them trans men because it would be anachronistic, but we are interested in using trans as an umbrella term that might connect experiences across space, across time, while at the same time respecting the differences between all of these experiences. And in this photo here, we have Raúl Luis Suárez, who was a man who was born in Spain and moved to Argentina. And here we can see him in his government job. And his paper started being published in his image and his story started being published in newspapers soon after his death, when he was, quote unquote, discovered to not be actually what we would today call a cisgender man. Secondly, we were really interested in looking at the different conditions of possibility for transmasculine lives within South America. So large parts of the region were under dictatorial military control, especially in the central part of the 20th century. Here we included images of two of the only men who we know who transitioned during or very soon after dictatorships in Brazil and Argentina. So the picture on the left is Eugenio Wright, and on the right we have João Neri. Again, they transitioned in the 70s and the 80s, but they only started disclosing very publicly and very openly that they were trans men over the past decade. So even though there were men who transitioned much before them, these are the first who explicitly self-identify as trans, or who recently started explicitly identifying their stories and their experiences as trans with their contemporary word trans. And then with Andrés, we were interested beyond just individual transitions in trying to find when transmasculine community and activism started existing in a more visible way within the region. And we found some examples from the 1990s, which are really important and really valuable, but we mostly found that transmasculine communities and activism began expanding in the 21st century and even over the past decade or so. So this is a huge contrast with what we might see in transmasculine histories in the US or Canada, for example. And finally, we wanted to highlight some of the local and transnational contributions of some transmasculine activists from the region. From the several examples we bring in our article, I wanted to highlight here just one individual, is more specifically because we don't have that much time, which is Mauro Cabral, who is a trans and intersex advocate and professional from Argentina. And we can see that he led, since the early 2000s, he's been leading very important changes in the international human rights system, for example, by applying human rights standards to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual characteristics. So he was one of the people who wrote the Yogyakarta Principles, which clarify how human rights should be applied to these subjects. And also his organization, which he co-founded, GATE, was a key actor in modifying the WHO's international classification of diseases to move trans-related diagnosis away from the chapter on mental health. And later on, and coming back to Argentina in 2012, Mauro again was one of the key actors in writing and passing the country's gender identity law, which is widely recognized to be a groundbreaking law since it depathologizes trans identities and also makes it free and depathologized and creates free and depathologized ways to access legal gender recognition and gender-affirming healthcare for whoever might be interested. And more recently, what we can see is several trans men and transmasculine people have been, again, prominent participants in the movements for reproductive rights and reproductive justice in Argentina. And thanks to this trans leadership, we can see that Argentina's most recent abortion right laws, which expanded access to abortion rights for all people, instead of just saying that it's a law that grants rights to women, the law explicitly says that it includes all persons with the capacity to gestate, which is quite important because, again, since in Argentina there are people with the capacity to gestate and to be pregnant who do have legal gender recognition, if the wording of the law only included women, we might really be in trouble if we needed to access these rights. As to add some final words beyond these brief vignettes that I had the opportunity to present today, what we were really intending to do with Andrés was try to show how the temporalities, spatialities, and modalities of transmasculine existence are contingent on local and regional historical, cultural, and political conditions. And what we mean by this is that both of us were really used to reading histories of transmasculinity located mostly in North America, which have been really inspiring and have really been guiding materials for us in certain senses. But also we realized that those stories looked very different from the local histories that we were both slowly trying to piece together. So we could see very different timelines according to the different political and social histories of our countries, but also we could find very different agendas and very different priorities within transmasculine activism across different regions.
5 minutes.
For example, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So for example, even regarding depathologization, for example, that has been a very large priority in activism in our region. And for example, in Argentina, it has already been achieved. But maybe in some other countries, depathologizing trans identities might not be a main priority due to the difficulties that might create in access to healthcare. So keeping this in mind, keeping all of this contingency of a transmasculine existence and activism in mind, but also serve to provincialize analysis of global North transmasculinity. And what this means is that it might encourage scholars working on global North or Anglophone transmasculine communities to also start to pay more attention to the conditions of possibility for all these different kinds of lives and activism in contrast to other regions. And finally, what we wanted to highlight also is the transnational circulation of ideas, individuals, and activism within the region and beyond. So many of the trans men whose stories we've briefly talked about today have received influences from trans people abroad, either because they realized that trans men could exist when they traveled abroad, or because they went abroad for surgery, or they read stories of trans people living in other countries, and that inspired them to change certain aspects of their own lives. But also we've tried to show how the reverse is also true, how South American trans men have also had a deep impact on how trans health and trans rights are understood more globally. So thank you for your time today. Here are both of our email addresses, and I could copy that in the Zoom chat if that's helpful for anyone. And again, thank you.
I do just want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which Eloise and I are coming from. So I'm coming from the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation, both the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people, and Eloise is coming in today from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And we do pay our respects to elders, past and present. And of course, given the theme of this conference, we also want to acknowledge the long traditions of gender diversity in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, including sister girls, brother boys, and other gender diverse trans mob out there. I do also want to just give a bit of a content warning that in the presentation, obviously this is about history, and some of the terminology is what we would now call offensive or outdated, but it was the terminology that was being used by the activists at the time. So I do just want to give that content warning, and also that there is at least one image of nudity here. So we're here to talk about the Gender Centre, which is the oldest continuing service provider for trans people in Australia. And as far as we know, it's the first government-funded trans service provider in the world. The picture on the left is from the opening of what was then called Tiresias House, where you've got a government minister there talking to some of the trans residents. The image on the right is the most recent issue of Polare magazine, which among Eloise's many talented roles, Eloise edits that. I'm going to talk a bit about the history, and then Eloise will talk more about the contemporary at the Gender Centre. So the Gender Centre turns 40 years old this year, but its history goes back a little bit further. In 1978, an activist named Nolina Tame founded what was called the Australian Transsexual Association. I think Nolina Tame is a bit of an unsung hero in Australian history, but we'd save her for another presentation. The ATA originally was a support group, a peer support group for trans women in Sydney. But then what changed it was in 1981 when Roberta Perkins came on board and became the secretary of the ATA. Roberta Perkins is probably the most prominent trans activist in Australian history. What Roberta did was started to transform it from more than just a peer support group into an advocacy group and eventually an activist group as well. In 1982, under Roberta's leadership, the group prepared a submission to the New South Wales Minister for Health, and she was pitching for them to set up a multidisciplinary gender identity center, which was inspired by something Roberta had seen in Boston. And it was essentially going to be a one-stop shop where trans people could get health, counseling, employment, post-prison reintegration, drug, alcohol rehabilitation, welfare, all sorts of social services. So she sent this proposal to the Ministry for Health, and they wrote back and said, sorry, budget's too tight. You should go talk to the Attorney General. The Attorney General wrote back and said, sorry, you should go talk to the Minister for Health. So this was knocked back. But Roberta was a very determined person. Some of the trans elders who I've interviewed who knew Roberta said stuff like, oh, that bitch, she'd never leave you alone. She'd never stop, which actually turned out to be quite good. So later in 1982, there was a court case in Australia that involved not recognizing some people's affirmed gender, and Roberta staged what is the first known trans rights protest in Australia. And that's a picture there from that protest. And Roberta was quoted as saying in the newspaper, if we are going to be called men, if the law insists that we are men, then we will exercise the privilege of men and remove our tops. Now, as I said, she didn't give up. In October of 1982, the New South Wales government announced the Community Tenancy Scheme. So this was like a social housing scheme that was designed to subsidize community groups that were looking for affordable housing for people in need. So Roberta basically took that proposal she'd done before, rejigged it, and pitched it to this scheme. Meanwhile, she published a book called The Drag Queen Scene. The title's misleading. It's not about drag queens. It's about trans women in Sydney. And it is a brilliant ethnographic study of the sort of snapshot of that period. She sent a copy of that book to the Minister for Youth and Community Services, Frank Walker, and he read it and it moved him. And he summoned Roberta to a meeting in July of '83. And he gave her funding for what became known as Tiresias House, which opened in October of 1983. And that's the famous photo of Roberta with Frank Walker at the opening of Tiresias House. And so Tiresias House was a refuge for trans women in Sydney, but as Roberta had envisioned it, it was always more than a refuge. It became a place for advocacy, health, welfare, etc. Now, because we want to make sure you have time to get to Eloise, I'm going to jump through the next bit quite a bit. It was running through the 1980s, and by the 90s, Tiresias House begins to face a little bit of an identity crisis. So in 1991, there's a group formed out of Tiresias House called the Transgender Liberation Coalition. And this would become a more radical activist group in the 90s. In 1993, Tiresias House changed its name to the Gender Center. That's what it's known as today. And around 1994, another group was formed called the Transsexual Action Group. And TAG and TLC, they hated each other. They really hated each other. TLC had a more social constructivist model of gender that we would more talk about today. TAG was trans women, but they were very much adhering to the old medical model where they were very much advocates for gender affirmation surgery. And to really be trans, you had to have gender affirmation surgery. And these two groups very much were fighting out over proposed anti-discrimination laws and birth certificate reforms, which did pass in '96. And essentially the TLC argument won for the anti-discrimination law. So in New South Wales anti-discrimination law, transgender is more broadly defined around identity, self-identification, and birth certificate, though, still requires you to have had gender affirmation surgery. And again, I apologize for the slur on the next line, but this is the term that was used. There was this period in 1996-97 of gender center history that was called the T-word wars, where that fight over the medical model versus the more social constructivist model really played out very much in the gender center, in the fight for the board of management. You had trans TLC activists led by Adie Griffin, Nori, Nadine Stranson, and Jesse Hooley on one side, and they were fighting the Gender Center Board of Management, who were very much promoting the more medical model. And this all really came to a head at the annual general meeting in 1996. There was a lot of drama. The meeting had to be canceled. It started again the next week. And eventually it was actually a tie for the 7th position on the board. So you had the TLC people winning 3 positions, the other group winning 3, and they actually had to go to a coin toss, and the TLC person won the final position on the board. There's then another period of tumult after that over leadership. That's a whole nother story, but things sort of settled down after 1997 under the leadership of a wonderful person named Elizabeth Riley. And the Gender Center enters a period of peace, of rebuilding, and they do a lot of switching towards training, providing for various services, advocacy around prison reform, advocacy around the gay games, which Sydney hosted in 2002. There's a lot of peer support groups set up. There's more inclusion of sister girls and brother boys and trans men. And that's where I'm going to hand it over to Eloise to take the story from there.
Thank you, Noah. So just a quick outline of what the Gender Centre currently does. We've heard a bit of an understanding about the history. The Gender Centre feels like it's in a really unique situation in that it came about, as we've kind of discussed, in an environment where people in Australian society were unaware of the existence of trans people per se, and that it was seen as the formation of the GC and the ongoing kind of maintenance of the GC and its funding was more about providing services and allowing a section of the Australian community, the trans community, to access services that were really, really important and needed, especially through the frame of health. So that has persisted for a long, long time, for 4 decades. And we have, in a lot of ways, up until quite recently, managed to sidestep a lot of the politics that we see in various places around the world. So in terms of service provision, and that's what I'm predominantly going to focus on to kind of update you or give you an idea. Health did a recent mapping, service mapping exercise and found that the GC delivered over 90% of the trans-specific services in New South Wales, which was very surprising to us in some ways, but it feels, working on that frontline service, it feels like we're doing 90% of the work. So the centre, in a nutshell, what we kind of started off at was as an accommodation service, so crisis accommodation. We've maintained that all the way through the decades of our existence. And so now we provide a certain number of beds for community members who are in crisis. That also goes hand in hand with the importance of case management, about helping community members, not just with the bureaucracy of transition, but also the discrimination that is hard baked into the systems that we have to deal with in Australia. In Australia, perhaps we think of the discrimination as slightly different than we might see it more headlined around the world. There hasn't been aggressively or overt discrimination against trans people until quite recently. But historically, what we've had to deal with is discrimination that is hardwired into systems. So the erasure of trans identity, the erasure of being able to access health services or housing services, all of those kinds of things that have kept or had traditionally kept trans people invisible in so many kind of detrimental ways. So the way that we deal with accommodation involves case management for community members, but also counselling and mental health support. So we've worked really hard to reframe our services at the GC around the old argument about mental health to do with trans people, so that the community, instead of avoiding accessing mental health support because somehow being trans is a mental disorder, we've worked really hard to reframe it about the importance of being able to tap into mental health services, counselling services to build resilience. The one thing that we see in our community over and over, and certainly in Australia and in New South Wales, is that isolation leads towards mental health kind of issues to do with stress, to do with anxiety, that leads on to some of the more the terrible kind of stats that we see around suicide ideation and the attempted suicide rates. So all of these kind of services kind of wrap together. And then I guess finally we talk about the importance of groups. So we run a series of groups for different members of the trans community and different kind of identities. We then work a lot in the space around education as well, with training. And we are in this unique situation in that we provide support for over 900 families, trans and gender diverse young people and their families in New South Wales. And so many of the debates and many of the kind of hot button issues that we see flashing up overseas around the inclusion of young people, these are issues that when we discuss this in the media, or when we discuss it with the in the wider conversation, we point to the existence of our family groups. We reiterate the importance of some of the stats that we have out of Australia, especially the one around the figure that between the ages of 12 and 24, trans and gender diverse young people have an attempted suicide rate of 48.1%, which is 20 times our national average. And we like to take that stat and point back to the fact that if you create an environment where families are supported and supportive and are able to provide that kind of safety net for their young people, then that attempted suicide rate drops through the floor to something around the national average. That's an extraordinary icebreaker in conversations when we're talking with bureaucracy about funding and about kind of managing things. The other thing that is worth mentioning too, thanks Noah for keeping up with me, is that in Australia, unlike other places, we have an existing anti-discrimination legislation. It was discussed to some degree, which recently was challenged a little bit, but was kind of overturned. And that anti-discrimination law just has certain kind of protections in place for the Australian community that we don't see in other places around the world. It's an essential kind of component of what protects the community in New South Wales. So we often get news stories. We get this kind of barrage of news stories from overseas that come in and a very kind of anxious and upset community. And we're able to say, this is terrible. This is happening overseas. You are protected in Australia to a certain degree. So I think, considering the limited time that I have to really talk about the service, I think it's really important to point out or underline the idea that a service can exist like ours that's been going on for decades. It can provide all of these services, 90% as I mentioned. It can connect with and move with and work with the trans community in Australia. It can reassure, it can communicate, and it can tell our stories in a way that actually gets to the really important issues that the community is dealing with, which is not the headline stuff that we see, but is actually the issues about making sure that our community is accessing health services in meaningful ways and not putting it off and adding to their own kind of existing mental health and physical kind of concerns. We talk about the inclusion of families, having those conversations, and about mitigating and managing the way that families can support our community more broadly. I'd like to finish off on this schoolwork that we do, but I won't. So thank you very much.
Our final presentation for this session is presented by Suzanne Lenon and Katie DeLucia-Burk, and they're presenting on teaching beyond the gender binary, challenging cisnormativity in a post-secondary institution.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thank you to our moderator and to the conference organizers and all the wonderful volunteers, and also to our other panelists for 3 really great papers. So we are presenting today on a teaching resource manual that we have co-created along with Stephanie Desrochers, who is an MSW student at the University of Calgary. And this manual is called Teaching Beyond the Gender Binary. So the main audience is faculty and instructors at the University of Lethbridge, where I am at, because some of the system details are specific, but we're hoping that it could be circulated for a wider use. So for those of you who don't know, Lethbridge, Alberta, is a small urban center of just over 100,000 people on the homeland of the Blackfoot Confederacy and Treaty 7 area. We are 2 hours south of Calgary and about 1 hour north of the US border with Montana. As the region's commercial and healthcare hub, Lethbridge is probably most known for its fierce prairie winds, social and religious conservatism, and proximity to the largest land-based reserve in the country, the Kainai Reserve, which is part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. All of these have shaped and continue to shape the city's physical, economic, and social landscapes. Alberta, as a settler state form, has long resisted the inclusion of queer citizenship claims. It circumvents the provision of, or the formation of GSAs and QSAs in schools through the discourse of parental rights. And it imagines itself, in the words of a former premier, as, quote, the province of the severely normal. So I teach in the Departments of Sociology and Women's and Gender Studies. And over the last 15 years, I have the privilege of seeing an increasing number of undergraduate and graduate students who self-identify as trans, non-binary, and/or genderqueer. These students bring a sharp critique to the biological determinism that underpins many of our disciplines and intellectual homes, including that of women and gender studies and sociology. These students have also disclosed to me their experiences of erasure, of marginalization, and harassment on the U of L campus. This is not surprising to any of us here, given how cisnormativity is embedded in the spaces and institutional processes of everyday life on campus. So this teaching resource manual has been something that I had been thinking about for a while, and it kind of became my project when I was awarded a teaching chair. So I had the pleasure of hiring Katie as my RA to conduct a literature review and institutional scan. And then Stephanie worked on this project as part of her MSW practicum placement in the winter of 2022. And then Katie returned to the project just this past fall as part of her BSW practicum and now continues in an RA capacity. And so this has definitely been a collaborative process, and we can talk about that later if we want. We use the concept of trans antagonism through the manual instead of the more common terminology of transphobia. As legal scholar Florence Ashley argues, the attitudes which impact trans people negatively are frequently neither irrational nor hateful, since they fit into a complex social ideology about gender and therefore appear neutral. Trans antagonism captures Eric Stanley's and Christina Sharp's notion of atmospheres that envelop so as to constitute the conditions of life in such a socially conservative climate such as Lethbridge. For us, atmospheres of trans antagonism are understood as bound up with, as part and parcel of, atmospheres of white supremacy, settler colonialism, capitalism, and ableism. In discussing the kind of the routes, I guess, that this manual would take, we've had conversations about, or we are wanting, I guess, to acknowledge the damage-centered nature of much of the scholarship regarding trans, non-binary, and genderqueer students and their experiences with and within post-secondary education, including the classroom. Eve Tuck defines damage-centered research as that which leverages people's pain and brokenness to make the case for reparations, yet simultaneously frames entire communities as depleted and broken. So following Tuck, we in this manual kind of want to flip the question and ask, what is it that is depleted and broken, and where does the problem lie? And so for our purposes, it is higher education and the U of L itself. We are in a time of equity, diversity, and inclusion, where discourses of EDI often fail, for example, to address cisnormative education practices, the role of higher education in reproducing racial and class stratification. Indeed, I think we need to acknowledge that universities themselves are an anchor for anti-trans intellectual thought. So another discussion that we've had. We are wary of the frame of inclusion to capture the ethos of what this resource manual seeks to do. It sits in a place of ambivalence as it endeavors on the side of pragmatism and harm reduction, basically asking my colleagues to be allies in material struggle, knowing full well that the tips and strategies within are mostly about reform and not revolution or abolition. So we resist finding an alternative word to that of inclusion for what this manual is trying to do. Or if pushed, we might make the claim that it offers resources and insights for how not to reproduce that which we have inherited in our scholarly disciplines, in our teacher training, and in our pedagogies. So perhaps what this teaching manual is a queer offering of moments of flight, from reproducing deeply intersectional, trans-antagonistic, and cisnormative violences, moments of flight that might help us and my colleagues imagine an otherwise of classroom cultures and teaching practices that allow trans, non-binary, and genderqueer students to thrive and flourish.
Cool. Thank you. So as Suzanne I'm so sorry, alluded to, the manual reflects the experiences of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer students that shared their experiences with us through interviews. Stephanie, being the lead on those interviews, conducted 7 individual hour-long interviews with students, as well as led 1 focus group. And students were from a wide variety of disciplines, from computer science to public health, education, and history, and that's just naming a few. And the students, the experiences they shared really contributed to shaping the contours of the manual, as well as the experiences of myself and Stephanie and Suzanne within the realm of academia. And we even also made sure to highlight the voices of students by including direct quotes, because we really wanted this to be a manual that reflected the material struggle of students and not just what the research says, but what students on our campus are saying. And some of the key themes that arose from our research and reading through these interviews were one of students spoke to invalidation, not only at the common sites such as names and pronouns, but also in the very core of their identities. And it manifested in what was said and also what wasn't said. It was taking shape of someone after a lecture saying non-binary isn't real. It was the absence of nuance and complexity when on discussions of the body in a realm of different subjects and disciplines. And it was the relegation of trans scholars, artists, activists, all forms, to the infamous LGBT day, or completely omitted from the curriculum. One student noted, when someone dead names me or uses the wrong pronouns, it ends up taking me out of what I am supposed to be doing. I'm trying to find ways to present more masculine and more androgynous so they don't have these experiences. And in fact, the need to police one's gender expression to avoid invalidation was a key theme across many of the interviews we had, especially for folks who identified as non-binary, genderqueer, or generally outside of what we might consider a more binary trans identity. Students also spoke to fear. The fear of being seen, and also the fear of not being seen. There was indeed a paradox of visibility, the hypervisibility of being othered for being seen as their gender identity, as well as the invisibility of having their gender identity invalidated or completely ignored. Students also spoke to labor, the need to speak up, to advocate, to educate, to offer correction. There was an ever-present negotiation in the classroom. Do I correct this statement? Do I offer an alternate perspective? Do I speak up when I hear something wrong and take on that labor and potentially make myself more vulnerable? Or do I withhold that information? Do I decide to protect my capacity and therefore let problematic narratives continue? This negotiation has no answer, especially for students, because the answer to this question takes place with the professor, the person leading the class, and not the student who's there to learn. Another student noted that trans identities get pushed under the rug and forgotten about altogether. There's so much to unpack, and a lot of instructors tend to gloss over it. They noted that a lot of their friends at the university noted they were the first trans person they'd ever met, and they therefore felt a constant burden to be an educator. But these students also spoke of resilience and of power, and the connection they found in community and the support therein, the solidarity they found with affirming educators and peers. The inherent power of throwing out outdated rules and defining themselves was a key theme. And despite the struggle of being in a cisnormative world and a cisnormative campus, they are not defeated nor broken individuals, but future agents of change in their fields, empowered by community and solidarity. And the themes that we identified in our interviews, honestly, if there was a Venn diagram between the body of research and what we got from our students, it would be a circle. Everything that showed up in our literature reviews and our environmental scans was corroborated by our interviews. Names and pronouns were not respected. Systems, both manual and technological, failed students consistently to protect their privacy and their dignity. Services and resources were underfunded or non-existent. And another key theme was the university as an important nexus for gender exploration and self-actualization. And that's why this manual is potentially more important than we can imagine, because not only are we considering students who were going to come out in the first place or were already out when they enter university, but students who are able to discover themselves within the walls of our institutions and making sure that they can access that space to explore and to navigate in a relatively safer environment.
Okay, hold on. So let me just find where I am here. So just very briefly, because I'm aware of our time, I just want to give a highlight of kind of how the manual is organized. So we have a substantive introduction. Then we have 3 key sections. So the first is called Fostering an Affirmative Classroom, and it offers kind of discussion and practical resources on some of the topics that Katie just talked about, how to navigate technical systems, how to, professors and instructors can address issues of unpaid emotional labor, The second section is on curricular and pedagogical considerations. So we offer, again, kind of ideas and resources to open up avenues for decentering of binary gender and cisnormativity in curricular design and pedagogies. So for example, we have kind of a whole section on discipline-specific resources. So anywhere from kind of academic writing and astronomy through to education and the STEM and to humanities. And then the third and final section we are calling right now supporting students. And so that is providing resources to support students outside the context of the classroom, because that too is part of the learning environment of a university, and action items that faculty and instructors can take to further their own knowledge and advocacy. And so I think Kate is going to wrap up by kind of talking a little bit, or we can do it together, but about our process of collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. So working on this project, especially as an undergraduate, was an amazing experience, especially working with someone with the experience of Suzanne, as well as another student in a master's program. I also felt a deep resonance with reading the interviews and my own experiences, and it was not an easy project to work on. And I really appreciated the fact that we started working on this manual with an understanding of the limitations. We were not fixing the institution. We were not transforming it in any way, but we were addressing the very immediate and material concerns of students, and that were impacting not only their mental health, but their own life chances and the ability to engage in learning in the ways that they were supposed to be able to as a student. And working in the university in the many facets that I do, I have seen the work of systems failing students quite regularly, often defended by individuals who have not done the homework, and seeing how systems can and do not work for everyone. So the approach of collegiality and collaboration on this project was incredibly amazing, and just for folks who would like to access this document, it is not quite ready for release. We are going through the final review process, but we should have it ready hopefully by the end of spring, and you can contact us if you'd like a copy.